This podcast is coming to you from Wongal, Gadigal and Birrabirragal country, also known as Balmain, where the Global Centre for Social Justice and Advocacy Leadership is located. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we share and agree that sovereignty was never ceded. So hello and welcome everyone to this episode of A JustER Generation. We are coming to you from Gadigal, Wongal and Birrabirragal country now. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today, it is our great pleasure to welcome to the podcast Professor Daniel Ghezelbash. Daniel is a professor and the director of the Kaldor Centre for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. He's an intentionally recognised scholar of international and comparative refugee and migration law. Before taking up the position of director at the Kaldor Centre, Daniel founded and directed the award-winning Macquarie University Social Justice Clinic and led the Law and Artificial Intelligence stream at the Macquarie AI-enabled Processes Research Centre. Daniel is a practicing refugee lawyer and he is a special counsel at the National Justice Project. He also sits on the board of a number of not-for-profit legal centres, including the Refugee Advice and Casework Service and Wallumata Legal. It's an absolute privilege to have you join us on A JustER Generation, Daniel.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Daniel, you were born here in Australia not long after your parents migrated from Iran as refugees. Many years later, you nearly lost your cousin after he attempted the dangerous journey from Indonesia by boat to seek asylum in Australia. The boat your cousin travelled on sunk, but he survived only to then spend many years in immigration detention facility in Australia. How did these experiences affect you, and how much influence did they have on your decision to focus your career on refugee law and I guess on social justice in that context?
Yeah, I guess in short, a huge influence. I think from a very young age, I was just acutely aware of how lucky I was to be here in Australia and I have all the safety and opportunities available to me as compared to my friends and family who were left back home in Iran. And I always felt with that privilege came a sense of responsibility. And my parents were fortunate enough to make the journey to Australia at a time where it was relatively easy to get a visa to travel here. And over the years, I saw family members resorting to increasingly dangerous and precarious journeys, both to leave Iran and travel to Australia. And the incident with my cousin was when I think it was my final year of high school, and it's a very formative time. And so he hadn't told. He had actually been waiting for his mom and his sister had been here for many years, and he'd been waiting for a family reunion visa for I think 6 or 7 years without telling any of us here in Australia. Well, we would have strongly advised him against doing so. He got on a boat from Indonesia to come here, and so it wasn't that his boat sunk. It was that there were reports that boats had sunk, and two boats had sunk. And so the first we heard of it was he told one of his friends that was here in Australia about that he was making this journey, and he got in touch with us and said that he was really worried about him, and he'd seen the reports of the boats going down. And it was a very anxious kind of week or so. We were waiting, but luckily his boat had headed back and was sort of marooned on a remote island, and ended up actually making the journey a week later on the same boat. But he was, after that very traumatic experience, he spent 3 or 4 years in immigration detention, and that was really around the time where I was deciding what to do at university, and that really pushed me in the direction of pursuing a career in the space that with an underlying purpose of ensuring that people all around the world who are in danger can access safety and a dignified life. And over the years, I think we've had, sadly, almost every draconian Australian policy has impacted one or more of my family members in different ways. Even up until more recently, I've had family members living very precariously on temporary protection visas.
I mean, and this is a little bit away from obviously the questions we sent through, but from the perspective of someone at the forefront of, thinking deeply about this, how do you bring, the two sides of Australia being literally at the start of the process of establishing the Refugee Convention, the human rights framework that we use as our international law, and yet now being known for introducing some of the most draconian, as you say, uh, arrangements, and in some ways being an example for the world of what you do to actually undermine some of those legal frameworks that have been at the heart of protecting people seeking safety in very precarious situations.
Yeah, look, I mean, that is the $1 million question, and I think I've been going to refugee law conferences and broader refugee issue conferences around broader refugee issues. Since my times as a university student, they all come back to this question of, how do you, the underlying cause for all of this is kind of public opinion and public sentiment, and how do we win hearts and minds? I think we have a lot more work to do to identify the ways to do that, and it's like part of what I'm interested in my work is, working with behavioral psychologists, kind of understand both why people hold contrary views, but also what the opportunities are in terms of how we have meaningful conversations across divides, and how we put out and frame our messages in the ways that are most effective.
We'll touch on that in a little bit later in the interview, because I do want to talk about that information and disinformation, misinformation and disinformation study that you've been doing through the Kaldor. But in 2018, you published your first book entitled Refugee Lost: Asylum Law in an Interdependent World. The book discusses the way restrictive asylum policies have spread around the world, with the European countries now possibly modelling their laws on Australia's harsher border control policies. Your book examines the process through which these policies initially spread between the United States and Australia, and the way the courts in each jurisdiction have dealt with the measures. You talk about a race to the bottom in terms of countries competing to close their borders to refugees. What does that actually mean?
So, put simply, it's really kind of, I guess, the competitive approach, or maybe like a vicious cycle that we're seeing around the world, where governments are seeking to outdo each other by implementing progressively more restrictive policies. And in a general sense, when devising asylum policies, governments kind of tend to weigh up their competitiveness in deterring unwanted immigration, and particularly asylum seekers, against the value of abiding by their international obligations. And uh, as more states opt for deterrence over protection, this places even more pressure on other states to do the same. And we've seen this unfortunately play out and amplify in the years since I wrote that book. And it's really having a absolutely devastating impact on the viability of the institution of asylum, and the ability of people in danger to reach safety.
I mean, is this partly a product of where we are in the world? And I'm just thinking in regards to that, because, the conflicts of the last 30 years and 40 years that really created the pressure on the systems within Europe and even the US and Australia, which were a result of the conflicts in the Middle East, often, that really developed a need for people to move. Is what we're seeing now, if you like, a counter response to what was created in that period, or is it simply a process of where countries are at in their political cycle? And is the reason I'm coming to this is there an opportunity for the world to return back to the norms and the approaches taken in the post-war period, or is the challenge just too great now with the number of people moving?
No, I think the the fundamental issue is around the kind of this prevalence of this competitive mindset,
Mm,
and the alternative, and what we need, and the only thing that can save the institution of asylum is to shift that to a cooperative mindset. And uh, I think that is the missing piece here, and I think that is part of what we had in the post World War II era that's missing now. Is that we need, rather than states working in isolation, and seeing this as a zero sum game, that the more restrictive they can be, they can shift responsibility to other states,
mm,
um, coming together, ideally at a multilateral level, but maybe as a stepping stone to that at a regional level, to develop responsibility sharing mechanisms. And I think that would be useful, of course, in terms of increasing access to protection, but also in terms of bringing the public along with you. If the public are assured that the state isn't acting in isolation, but they're doing more in return, other countries are also doing more, it'll be much easier to bring the public with you. Going back to our discussion earlier.
mm. Well, that brings me, I guess, to the next point around misinformation, disinformation. And the Kaldor Centre recently published a report titled Countering Misinformation About Refugees and Migrants. It is an evidence based guide to help understand how misinformation or false narratives about refugees works and what to do about it. Why does this matter so much today? And do you think it is possible to obtain meaningful change in Australia around this particular issue? And I'm thinking just the challenge of managing social media and managing the way in which information travels in the world. It's such a the genie's out of the bottle, as they say. It's very, very difficult.
Yes, it is indeed. It's very, very difficult. But look, I do think there is hope, and I do think it's possible. And to answer your first part of your question, misinformation, not just in the refugee space, but generally, is one of the biggest threats currently facing our societies and the viability of our democratic institutions. And uh, the by kind of caused by and contributing to a more fragmented society, which means we can't have the we can't come together and have meaningful discussions about the most pressing issues and challenges that we face. And while it is a threat to us all, the worst harms tend to fall on people like migrants and refugees, which are
Mm,
often the target of misinformation. And they face social exclusion, impacts of really harsh policies, and so the the problem is a profound one.
mm,
Um, and we're also seeing increasingly misinformation actually specifically targeting migrant and refugee communities in order to divide them for political gain.
mm,
And there's, I guess, a number of levers available to address this. And I think, I'll start with what our report doesn't do, which is kind of the more long-term strategies. And part of it is around sort of media literacy and education, so the public can engage in a critical manner with the information that they find, particularly on social media.
mm,
There's another piece there around uh, the regulation of social media platforms, and we had the failed attempt uh, earlier this year or last year for to introduce legislation in this space. Um, and I think that those pursuing those longer term strategies are really important. What we do with this report, though, is I guess give very tangible and practical guidance for uh, organizations and individuals who are interested in kind of pushing back with respect to misinformation they see. And part of it was just finding an evidence base to deal with some of the challenges that I'd experienced in my own work as well. And we get requests all the time at the Kaldor Centre to comment on all sorts of outrageous comments made by various public figures and politicians. And I always had this hesitation of engaging because you don't want to give these issues more airtime, but then there's also the risks in not engaging because you're letting others kind of dictate the direction of the public narrative. So, and so really that's at the heart of the framework. So we engage the behavioural insights team. I mean, they're that sort of a crack team of behavioural psychologists that kind of gained renown as part of their work as the UK nudge unit working
the
for
nudge unit.
at the UK
nudge
government.
Theory.
The nudge, so I just really wanted to know, how do we decide when to engage, and then also how do we engage most effectively based on the latest behavioural science literature. And so we basically the report has like a decision tree. It tells you various decisions you have to make about when not to engage, and then when to engage. How do you engage? Design your interventions in a way that are most likely to be successful.
I mean, I'm fascinated with this as well, and maybe we can just expand a little bit on this, because one of the things for us as a Global Centre for Social Justice and Advocacy Leadership we're wanting to lean into is not just the evidence-based research and advocacy approach, but also the tools of the trade. And I'm very struck, and this is sort of leans into the next question as well, around how the tools of the trade have changed dramatically, particularly in the last 10 years, where in advocacy, the traditional tools of the trade was obviously public events, putting a one-page newspaper advertisement into a major paper, getting a signatory, a petition in play or a parliamentary submission. All of these things are still there, but in reality, in the consensus building, bringing people together and being motivated, people's attention is taken up almost 24 hours a day on their screens and on their social media, and increasingly through artificial intelligence. This makes me think that, perhaps what we need to be thinking about is how we lean into the technology as well, understand the algorithms, understand how others are using this in order to achieve their influence, often at quite low cost. And I think about the difference on the referendum around the amount of investment that was put in the yes campaign versus the no campaign, and how effective the no campaign was, particularly in utilizing social media as a means to getting their narrative into play. What are your thoughts?
Look, 100%. And that was actually sort of partially the approach we took in this report, which was the first understanding how misinformation is spreading online, and the effectiveness of what strategies are people using and why they're effective. And the final part of the report is precisely on this point. It's about engagement strategies, and they apply not only in response to how we deal with misinformation, but just in general, how we engage with the public. And again, a lot of that is drawn on lessons from what I guess we would consider what the bad actors are currently doing in the space. And my approach has always been to try and be adaptive as possible, and kind of try and understand and as far as possible embrace new technologies when they come. And I think engaging in the new social media landscape is a really important one for us to grapple with in terms of how we engage effectively. But I mean, it's challenging. It's very challenging, and the biggest challenge is around how you engage across divides on social media, because it's very easy to engage with your core supporters, and by its nature, the algorithm creates all these silos, but it also creates all these barriers for being able to bridge those silos and engage with people who might hold contrary views to you that you want to persuade.
No, it's amazing when you think about how influential it's been in often, as we would see as bad actors, as you say, in the space, and that includes terrorist groups and others getting into young people's
Mm,
influence,
yeah.
as well as people who advocate for misogyny and a range of other things,
Mm,
that are really uh, far more targeted to target groups than it's ever been possible to do. And that's something which I think is really about how to understand the technology. But it's not like it has never been used. When I think about the Obama campaign
mm,
in
mm,
the 2008, it was driven by the use of social media and
mm.
actually getting a very different
Yeah.
narrative into the public space. So it's obviously possible
Yes.
to do it in other ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, it definitely is possible, but I have to say it is more difficult for us than for the bad actors to be using it for this purpose.
Mm,
And the reason is that you know so much, and looking at this, we have to map out these various behavioral psychology principles that kind of drive the spread of misinformation, and so much of it relies on actually just causing outrage and
mm.
also being slippery with the truth. And uh, it can be more difficult sometimes for us to do those things, or not appropriate for us to do those things. And so, yeah, it's in some ways it's not a level playing field.
Yeah, so it's almost the algorithm backing the system, the way in which they work, along with obviously the nature of those bad actors
Yes.
and their ability to be uh, able to do things in a certain way
Yeah.
means that it privileges their position
Yeah.
over others. Uh, in addition to being an expert in refugee law, you are one of Australia's leading experts on legal technology and generative AI. I think one of the fascinating aspects of your research is that it is highly transdisciplinary, weaving politics, law, technology, history, and other disciplines. Why is this so important to you? And how does this change the impact of your research?
Yeah. So I mean, I think I've long thought that one of the biggest barriers to kind of bridging the gap between research and societal change, and I guess ability to tackle the big problems facing society, is the siloization of academic research.
Mm,
And uh, this led to, I guess, a fragmentation of knowledge, and I guess a loss of a holistic understanding that can undermine the role of academics and experts to tackle the big challenges facing the world. And so, I guess, both in my own work, but also more broadly at the Kaldor Centre, we've kind of been very deliberative about kind of both developing and advocating for interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary approaches to research, um, precisely for the reason is that we feel that it's absolutely essential if we want to drive impact and address the big issues, in particular in the refugee context where we work.
mm,
And yeah, I have to say, in my work, the pieces of research that I have done that have had the most real world impact tend to be the ones that are kind of most transdisciplinary in nature. And I think the one example is the work we've been doing at the Kaldor Data Lab for the last few years, where we've kind of analyzed data covering 40,000 decisions made in refugee cases in
mm,
Australia in the courts and tribunals. And part of that data was obtained through kind of more traditional means through FOI requests. But for the judicial review data set, we use computational methods to extract the data points automatically from large volumes of public cases. And those sorts of opportunities that technology brings in this space really yeah, broaden the scope for doing really novel research and also just building larger and stronger evidence bases. And uh, the so I mean some of the key, I guess, impact we've driven through that work is firstly around legal representation,
mm,
and across all the tribunal and the former AAT, as well as in the judicial review before the Federal Circuit and Family Court. uh, our data revealed a really strong increase in prospects of success correlating with having legal representation, and that kind of fed in partially to the decision of the government to reinstate some funding for free legal free legal refugee service providers last year.
I mean, I think it's interesting you're saying this because it's almost like the industrial age of thinking and approach to disciplines needs to catch
Yes,
up with the
yes,
information age, which
yes,
we all are living in at the moment,
yes,
and which, as
yes.
you say, is this broader ecology that brings all of these things together. In that context, you're now using a groundbreaking data technology to help increase people's access to justice. And an excellent example of this is the Kaldor Centre's recently launched free AI complaints platform, Hear Me Out. Could you tell our listeners a little bit more about this?
Yeah, so I guess this is my other like very big area of interest. It's around technology and access to justice more broadly, and the a starting point. I guess the problem that we're trying to address is that right now, almost 80% of Australians that have a legal problem can't access any form of legal assistance, and uh, you know, I think technology can play quite a big role in addressing that gap. Not entirely, but in certain areas, it can help. The problem is that even though there's been a huge push around the law firms embracing technology and AI in their workflows, it's really been concentrated in sort of commercial law firms, particularly large commercial law
Mm,
firms. And I think if we're going to see those possible benefits for kind of broader society come to fruition, we can't rely on market forces to do that for us. And so I really see that as like an area as an academic that I could be contributing to. And this project, Hear Me Out, with the National Justice Project, uh, is kind of just deals with it with a discrete area of law. It's around complaint making, and we have more than 300 government-funded and government-run complaint bodies across the country. They're generally quite well run and provide a really uh, an opportunity for, I guess, low cost and informal resolution of people's legal problems or issues. But the problem that the National Justice Project had identified as a sort of frontline legal service provider is that people just don't know where to go. It's so confusing. You have 300
mm,
complaint bodies, and um, they would often get calls, many calls a week from the public asking assistance with complaints. Even for lawyers, it's so hard to sift through all the different bodies and the overlapping jurisdictions, and so with Hear Me Out, we kind of leverage the power of generative AI. And I know it has a very bad rap in the legal space about sort of hallucinations and giving you wrong answers, but we spent a lot of time building in guardrails, but also producing trusted information through our pro bono partners for it to rely on as sort of the fact sheets that power the whole thing. And so uh, what that means in practice is now, we've rolled it out in New South Wales, but we're rolling out progressively in other states. But anyone in one of the states covered can jump on, who's felt like they've been wronged in some sort of way, type what happened to them in their own words, and then very quickly get information about which complaint bodies would be most appropriate for them to pursue their complaint, and also at this next stage of development, which will hopefully go live in the next few months, we're actually using generative AI tool to help people actually draft their complaint. So that was the other second barrier that we identified in complaint making. The first was where to go. We've kind of tackled that. And the second one is actually drafting a complaint.
mm.
And we're working on that
I
component
mean,
now.
can I ask a question on this? Does this ultimately lead to? I mean, I used to work. This is a term, terrible term, that we used to use to describe the change into business was a disintermediation process of information, basically removing the middleman
Mm.
out of the system. Will this lead to potentially a disintermediation of parts of the legal profession because of the fact that you don't have to rely on legal advice on for certain things? You may have to rely on it as it reaches a certain level, but for much of what is the day to day needs, you can probably get your answers and get your process in place without necessarily involving a lawyer at all, potentially.
Yeah, so I guess the distinction that we draw is between legal information and legal advice.
Okay.
And so I think we're seeing that that play out with respect to legal information, and the transformative impact that sort of new technologies and AI can play is that legal information in the past was a generic fact sheet that you'd find on like a legal service provider's website. It was in no way tailored to your specific circumstances. What these new tools allow is that it actually what it spits out is much it's quite akin to a fact sheet, but it's one that is tailored to your specific circumstances. I think there'll always still be that role for well, at least for the foreseeable future, for when you actually, for legal advice, when for more complex matters. But I do think the kind of empowering people with legal information can be quite transformative in and of itself to help them self-navigate their issues where possible, particularly given that so many people are self-navigating already. And so finding a way to help those people and improve their experiences and empower them more is very positive.
And can I ask, does this system, will it be able to be used in different languages where people may not necessarily be fluent in English, or is it
Yeah.
English dependent?
No. So that is again what we're rolling out in this next next update. So the we very much see it as an iterative platform, and we're rolling out more and more functionality. But yeah, no, the coverage of multiple languages, but also voice to text. So you don't need to type anything. You don't even need to read the outputs. You can just talk to it, and it will give you the responses through voice generated content as well.
I mean, this could be absolutely transformative globally as well. When you think about, if it's able to be adapted for different jurisdictions with different, obviously, legal frameworks, I mean, it's a bit like a universal translator for law.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the big opportunity and what we're hoping to move it forward. So, I mean, this is a very discrete area of complaints, but I think what it does, it kind of lays the groundwork and kind of proof of concept for what I kind of like to term kind of a broader legal diagnosis tool.
Mm.
And just the same way that we have sort of online AI medical diagnosis tools that help you diagnose medical issues, although not always accurately. So maybe it's not the best example, but you could imagine something similar where often people don't even know they have a legal problem. So starting from that point of this happened to me, to then being able to diagnose whether this is a legal issue and what that legal issue is, and just providing some basic information would be an absolute huge game changer.
Mm. And as generative AI will constantly be learning as well, and building its capacity to be able
Yeah.
to respond effectively.
Yeah, but we can't rely on and this is the other issue we face, is that a lot of people are relying on the standard AI models now for legal advice, and they are just simply not fit for purpose for that.
No.
I mean, they don't have the. I mean, part of the issue is a lot of the stuff is you get answers drawing on U.S. law because that's the main corpus it's been trained on. It's often not up to date. It's just missing all the nuance. So really, the future really lies in building sort of custom kind of expert systems where you can collate human expertise in a format that the AI can access and provide answers based on.
Amazing. I mean, this has been a very techie discussion, but it's been a wonderful, wonderful conversation, Daniel. And, I'd love to keep the conversation going in future, particularly as the Kaldor Centre develops more of this stuff that you're doing, but also builds more on what the other work in terms of the reports that you're developing and the sort of framework that you're bringing to the context of refugee and people seeking asylum's rights more broadly. My last question, and one that I ask all our guests: if there were three things you would advise your younger self, given what you know now, what would they be?
I'm always very hesitant to dole out advice. I'd like to be on the receiving end of advice rather than giving advice. But look, I think
I
one
remember this is to yourself, not to
to
anyone
myself.
else.
Yeah, I guess that's true. That's true. So strictly to myself. Look, I think the one is around just like you can't do this alone,
Yeah.
and the any form of kind of lasting social change or lasting reforms requires a really broad sector of collaborations, and you've got to start building these relationships. And so co-developing proposals, strategies, ideas from the ground up, and inherent in that is also just really learning to listen and understand diverse perspectives, both of your allies, but also of those that you're trying to persuade. I guess my second piece of advice is around just taking care of yourself. And all advocacy work, but particularly work in the refugee context where I work, which is so politically charged, can be very emotionally demanding, and it's very easy to get burnt out and disillusioned. Often it's one step forward, two steps backwards, unfortunately. But I think it's important to kind of celebrate the small victories along the way, but also to kind of make sure you have a way of finding joy outside your work that you can revert to when things are particularly difficult, because there will be times when things are going to be really difficult. And I guess the final one is just taking charge of your own time and being, I guess, proactive and reactive. And there's going to be so many different and competing demands on your time, and you can't say yes to everything, and you have to be strategic in what you take on and what you say no to, just to ensure that you can focus and advance the things that you care about most. And I think there's a fun leadership quote from Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky, who say, leadership is disappointing people at a rate that they can absorb. And I think it's not just around leadership, but also more broadly about how we go about our work.
No, those are such wise pieces of advice on all levels, Daniel. And, I think there are so many reflections I've had over the last few episodes of a JustER Generation, which are very similar. So you're in good company, but it also you've expressed a couple of things that actually are really useful as well. I think even to myself in terms of taking on this work, but also to others in the climate justice space, in other areas of social justice, where you really are fighting often for things that are not necessarily in everyone's immediate thought as something that's important. And actually, when in the larger scheme of things, it is very important, not just to those who are affected by it, but to society as a whole. And it is something which I think, as you say, you need to look after yourself, you need to prioritize, and you need to have the sort of resilience to navigate the setbacks, which are a part of the work. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you.
No, it's been a really great conversation, and you're now an alumni of a JustER Generation. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of a JustER Generation. Now it's your turn to take action. Change happens when we come together, so be sure to like, subscribe, and share this episode, and consider making a regular donation to the Kaldor Centre for Social Justice and Advocacy Leadership by visiting our website www.erc.org.au/donate. Your support powers real change. Together, we can build a JustER Generation for all.